I'll give the floor to Dominique Belpomme, who is going to tell us about markers, because Mr. Belpomme is different from others in the sense that he worked with a cohort of EHS affected people, more than 2,000 people, and he tried to identify markers. Precisely. I would like to make a remark about what has just been said. We need to distinguish the real causes from the risk factors. There may be a cause for EHS, such as a chemical or an electromagnetic field. We should distinguish it from risk factors, which are favoring factors. For example, if we take tobacco consumption, smoking, the fact of smoking is a risk factor, but the real causes are the carcinogenic molecules that are in tobacco smoke and the residual tar that you take in after burning. So causes have to be distinguished from risk factors. That's something I wanted to say in reply to what has just been said. First of all, I would like to reassure the electro-hypersensitive people in this room by saying that the medical and scientific community at the international level is united in the momentum to secure the recognition of electro-hypersensitivity. There has been many publications, not always easily accessible by lay people, but they exist. And to such an extent that I'm currently negotiating with the WHO and Dr. Marianne Herrera, who's the manager of the WHO Health and Environment Department, to organize, as we did it in 1997 in Atlanta, we are trying to organize a similar meeting about electro-hypersensitivity. Well, all this to tell you that despite the opinions we hear all over the place and despite the obstacles, we're making progress. Science is making progress. It is slow, but it will get somewhere. And that's my optimistic view that I wanted to share with you. Now, there are three problems. Now we're talking about electro-hypersensibility. In the past, we spoke about electromagnetic fields and the toxic effects of electromagnetic fields. Now we're speaking about electro-hypersensitivity. There are three problems that physicians and scientists have to cope with: the suffering of the ill people and evaluation of that suffering, and the medical diagnosis. And according to my information, WTO is looking at how hypersensitivity, EHS, can be properly diagnosed. And the true issue, it was said already, what is the share of electromagnetic fields as cause of electro-hypersensitivity? What we are showing is that electromagnetic fields are partly responsible, of course, but also chemicals are incriminated. But chemicals have a lower share in that phenomenon than electromagnetic fields. So we use as a basis scientific evidence. We're not only bringing words to the table, we are looking at the scientific evidence published in serious magazines. Well, we worked on a cohort of 2,000 people. It's the largest series of people, the largest group of people that has been studied. Then each patient has been examined. It is not a questionnaire that has been submitted to them for them to fill in. It is an examination, a medical examination with anamnesis, a proper anamnesis, a neurological physical exam. And you'll see that contrary to what the WHO says, certain symptoms are objective. They are seen when there are skin injuries. Well, you cannot deny them. Otherwise, you deny medicine as a whole. And thirdly, the most important point is that in 25% of the cases, EHS is associated to MCS. And MCS can make it more complicated. The multiple chemical sensitivity, and in most cases, MCS has not been taken into account as associated and compounding EHS. So, I'm going to try to tell you about these different elements as briefly as I can. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh. So it's on now. The presentation is the following. We present here the results we obtained from the analysis of a large cohort of more than 2,000 electrohypersensitivity and or multiple chemical sensitivity. So we confirm our previous findings showing that both EHS and MCS are associated in 25% of the cases and shared identified symptoms and biological changes in the framework of a common neurological syndrome. I heard... Well, in the literature, there are 2 or 3 publications, not more than that, that it is a neurologic syndrome, which means that the patients have been examined by a physician. No medical diagnosis can be established without the intervention of a physician. Next slide. The inclusion criteria are very specific in our study. As far as MCS is concerned, we have used the Atlanta consensus criteria, while for EHS, we have used the WHO 2006 criteria. And we have added to those criteria other criteria, which you are going to see. Chronic evolution. Well, we have reproducibility of symptom occurrence under low intensity level of presumed electromagnetic field source, the regression or disappearance of symptoms when incidents are removed. Well, these are the Atlanta criteria. What we add to those are the following criteria: the absence of any other known pathology accounting for the observed clinical symptoms, and the absence of any pre-existing pathology such as atherosclerosis, diabetes, neurodegenerative or psychiatric disease. Well, in addition to those criteria, there is a host of additional criteria. It's very important. We have examined our patients as Hippocrates, just like Hippocrates wanted us to do it, by listening to what the patients said, but by also decoding in an unbiased way what they were telling us. Next slide. So we examine our patients with a systematic face-to-face questioning and a physical examination of all included patients. So we cannot be criticized for using a non-medical methodology. So these are the evolutions of these 2,000 cases. Let's skip it. Let's skip the following one. No, this is very important because we have found out what everybody finds in the studies mentioned, in all the studies that can be found in the literature. A clear dominance of women. And there is no difference between EHS and MCS, more women than men. And the majority is at the end of their 40s. And 85% of them have an association of EHS and MCS, as if there was a sexual marker, a genetic sexual marker that enables us to say that women are more hypersensitive than men. So there are more women than men in our cohort. Next slide. We confirmed that in 25% of the cases, there was an association between EHS and MCS. So out of 2,000 cases, 2,000 patients, well, all these people were examined by one single people. The analysis were carried out by the same lab specialized in identifying markers. So it's a very reliable study. Next slide. The symptoms. Well, it's quite complicated to read, so I'm going to try and summarize them. The main symptoms. I'm not well, you have called migraine what I call headaches. But, well, we can discuss that. What is important in EHS is the predominance. Well, we compared with a control group, of course. 100 people were in our control group. There are significant differences in all symptoms. Expect hyperemotivity that were found in among a number of control group patients. But for all other symptoms, there was a very clear-cut difference between the control group and the EHS patients. So we compared EHS with MCS. Well, both patients have headaches. You have MCS, you have headaches. You have EHS, you have headaches. But you have more frequent otalgia, earache, in EHS. Well, probably because those patients use their cell phones more than MCS patients, which accounts for their EHS. And also sleep disturbances and a tendency to have depression tendency. As far as MCS patients are concerned, we find more eye issues and more ear issues. And this is related to MCS, which is actually an illness which affects the upper respiratory tract. And we find more anxiety or panic in MCS patients. There are commonalities between both, but in terms of symptoms, there are small differences, subtle differences. How about combining both, what we call the mixed syndrome, EHS plus MCS? Well, we have a much larger number of symptoms. We have skin injuries, and these are clear objective symptoms. We have 46% of skin injuries when patients have both EHS and MCS, against 5% in MCS patients. But there are things that can only be seen when you examine the patient. So balance disturbances, imbalance issues, balance disorders. And we've also identified a crippling ictus, which is paralytic ictus. Well, these ladies become paralyzed all of a sudden. They're totally paralyzed, and or one limb or two limbs are suddenly paralyzed, and the paralysis disappears a little while afterwards. It's what I call paralytic ictus. This is typical of EHS only. Oh no, it also occurs when EHS is associated with MCS. There is more confusion when the syndrome is the mixed syndrome. There is more sleep disturbance and ear, nose, throat issues. So the symptoms are much wider and much stronger when both pathologies are associated. Next slide. Next slide, please. These are the kind of injuries, skin rashes, that appear in 45% of the cases of EHS and EHS MCS patients. You cannot deny that these symptoms are frequent and objective. WHO is aware of that. They are aware that EHS is not some kind of mental illness or imaginary illness. It is a medical condition, just like any other one. We have spoken about biomarkers. Of course, there was a meeting that bring together more than 30 specialists in the field of electrohypersensitivity who co-signed this consensus-based article. In order to make a medical diagnosis, you need biomarkers. And a biomarker does not need that there is an etiological diagnosis. The only thing you do is the diagnosis of a certain biological condition that can lead to the diagnosis of the illness. So the biomarkers, we're going to skip vitamin D2, D3. Histamine is a marker because it increases in more than 40% of the cases, just like migraine or headaches. So IgEs, not significant, but the protein S100B. Intensive care unit physicians have shown that there is an infection in the brain. There is a brain trauma. It is an examination that is carried out in an emergency case when there is a cranial trauma. So the nitrosative oxidative stress is also a clear marker. And it shows the opening of the brain-blood barrier. And also HSP27 and or HSP70, which are markers of cellular stress. These markers are very high in certain cases. And certain patients also show an autoimmune response by the increase of the secretion of the anti-myelin P0, which is a protein of autoantibodies against that oppose this protein. Myelin surround nerve cells, and it shows that there is an autoimmune response in those patients. There is also a decrease of the hydroxymelatonin sulfate. There is less hydroxymelatonin sulfate in 80% of the cases, while in 10% of the cases it actually increases, but we don't know the reason for that increase. Is it a hyperproduction under the effect of electromagnetic fields or under the effect of certain chemicals? Because it is secreted by the pineal gland. Now we're stepping into a field of biology that should enable us to better understand the syndrome. Biomarkers. In between 14 and 24% of the cases, we have not found markers. So the markers are not an exhaustive, a comprehensive solution to everything. Next slide. This is what happens in the different patterns, EHS, MCS. 14 to 24% of patients do not have markers, and all of a sudden there is 1, 2, 3, 4 markers. The higher the number of markers, the lower the ratio of patients with those markers, but it matches the very definition of marker in cancerology. Next slide. So we talk about tests, their specificity. No, markers are non-specific. The markers we've used are non-specific because they can be found in other pathologies. So there is no specificity, but it only means that we need other criteria to be able to describe or to identify specifically the illness. Sensitivity. In 14 to 24% of the cases, there were no markers. So this is no solution. Now the reproducibility. They were reproducible in the same laboratory, but we are waiting for other people to carry out this kind of tests in other laboratories, maybe using other markers. Next slide. This is very important. This was said by Mrs. Stein. There is a research team that is currently publishing their results. No ordinary RMI is going to be helpful, only the functional RMI. But there are very few centers where that kind of IRM is carried out. So other radiological investigation methods have to be used, like the transcranial Doppler ultrasonic technique. It's confirmed in a number of cases that there were issues with the medial brain artery. So we have an objective characteristic that proves that this is a true pathology. And we have used the encephaloscans that we spoke about earlier. They show us a very important point, but we also used what the Americans called SPECT, that is a single photon emission computed tomography technique. And everything, all these methods show that there is something happening in the brains of the patients. Next slide. So these are the results of the transcranial Doppler ultrasonography. They show the abnormalities. This is very important. It is a criticized examination, and the College of Physicians in France is attacking me for that. But this examination is very important because specifically locates the abnormalities in the brain of EHS patients. So on the left-hand side, you have a normal patient, a normal person, and on the right-hand side, an EHS patient. There is a French patent on this technique, but it's taken over in the United States in order to increase the quick means of investigating those patients. When you see the blue columns, there is a drop in tissue pulsing. So on the left, it's the right hemisphere of the brain, and the right-hand side, it's the left hemisphere of the brain. What we can see is that in the capsulothalamic region of the brain, between the capsule and the thalamus is the center of sensitivity. There is a pulsatility, pulse deficit, and this examination is 100%. Through that examination, so it is an approach that really helps differentiate an EHS patient from a normal subject. So I'm really trying now to reinstate this kind of examination, which was much criticized in France, which is still much criticized. We can here locate it, the abnormality. And there is an injury in the limbic system. This is clearly shown here by a functional MRI brain scan. I was included in the hypothesis section of this meeting. It might have been a better idea to include me in the evidence section, but never mind. We have objective arguments that show without any doubt that there are areas that are lit up at rest. It's called a modular network deficit, DMN, abnormal default mode network. So we're working on concrete evidence. Next slide. The same here. SPECT. There are abnormalities which are very visible. They have nothing to do with, this shows that EHS has nothing to do with an imaginary disease. Now, is EHS related to electromagnetic fields? Well, we have fact-based arguments, we have evidence that is strong enough that the relationship between EHS and electromagnetic fields is very likely. We reject the idea of a psychiatric or psychosomatic theory. There are so many such theories around. We know that MCS is recognized at the international level as a somatic condition. If in 25% of the cases EHS is associated to MCS, it can't be psychological.
So we need to work in a very rigorous way, strict way, and we should not provide philosophy around EHS, then I believe it is obvious that thanks to our markers, we have been able to highlight a change with the background inflammation, the opening of the blood-brain barrier, etc., etc. Everything has been demonstrated in animals, and this is clearly linked to an exposure to EMFs. So in human beings, we have lesions and biological changes that correspond to what we have observed in animals, and that was related to EMFs for animals. So this is an indirect link.
Logiquement, les champs de l'EHS.
And from a chronological point of view, EHS appeared following the adoption of artificial sources of EMFs, Wi-Fi, etc., wireless technologies, which means that from a chronological point of view, we have a pathology that did not exist a century ago, and it does exist now, following the introduction of these wireless communications and these man-made EMFs. And again, this is not limited to one region. It's all over the planet. We have Wi-Fi everywhere. And this change happened at the same time in all countries. And we can see that everywhere. So do you believe that this could be a special effect related to psychological or epigenic elements? No, of course. Now, of course, the nocebo effect is possible in some patients, but you need to establish a distinction between the causes and the psychological effects. Then we also have challenge studies that were developed with healthy volunteers. And I asked my colleague Philippe Yerac to find negative studies. Apart from the Belgian study, there were no negative studies. They are all in favor of this fact that there is a link with EMFs. And of course, this is something that we published. And this needs to be taken into account. It's not one study, it's dozens of studies. So when we're saying that we do not have enough studies and that we haven't been able to make progress, it's not really true. We have made progress, but what we lack today is a synthesis of all publications. And we need to be brave enough to look at what has been published. Now, of course, we need to look for these publications. And then finally, I would like to say that there are epidemiological studies that show that because of EMFs, you can have the same symptoms as for sensitivity tests with sleep disorders, for example. And then you have suicide. And all of these elements have been demonstrated in epidemiological studies. You can find that information in that kind of publications. And then I'd like to try and conclude. If you look at the medical history of patients, you will see the same types of exposure to electromagnetic fields. Adults, young people, you will see that there is this exposure in their medical history. So I really wanted to insist on the vision we have, and we should not only focus on questionnaires. Then I'll skip the other points. Sorry, I can't read. But yes, EMFs cause lesions. And Dimitris told us about other effects, about molecules. And these are genetic facts. But you know, this is very complicated because it can be genetic, epigenetic, or another phenomenon. Biology is something that is very complicated. You need to be a biologist to understand. And I believe that in front of me, we have a person who understands the problem and sees where the problem lies. But all of these findings are not absolute facts. But this publication was analyzed by a reading committee, and it is considered as a highly probable hypothesis. So I believe it is important to reassure the EHS patients because we are making progress. Maybe one last point. I have many other things I wanted to share with you, but I would like to tell you that in 10% of the cases, MCS actually precede the occurrence of EHS. So there might be a chemical cause that appeared before the occurrence of electrohypersensitivity. And that's where I sometimes disagree with what we can see in scientific literature, because EHS should be defined, as it is the case for MCS, as a lowering of the tolerance threshold to EMFs. And for MCS, it is related to the threshold related to the exposure of chemical products. So in my view, MCS and EHS are part of the same neurological disorder. Then as to the WHO and what they recognize about EHS as being related to EMFs, everything is mentioned. They're talking about the threshold, the limit of exposure, and I believe it is important to make a distinction between the IEI EMF from EHS. That's very important. Next slide, and of course I'm at your disposal during our discussion if you have other questions. Yes, this slide. Why should we abandon the psychogenic and psychosomatic theories for EHS causality? I just addressed an article. It was published. It is online now. And I read in English, psychogenic or psychosomatic symptoms do not mean causality. That's very clear. It's not because you have psychogenic or psychosomatic symptoms that you have the cause. Not at all. You have to find the cause of that psychosomatic symptom. So people who say that this is only a psychogenic problem do not understand the problem. Then you have objective psychopathological changes with the oxidative stress in EHS patients. We wrote an article about this. So that's very clear. It's not specific, but this is a possible explanation. As it was highlighted by Dimitris earlier, it has a role to play in the mechanism, but it is not the only issue. Okay, I have to stop here, so I'll stop here. But of course, it doesn't mean that there is no nocebo effect that actually can be added to the cause related to chemical products and electromagnetic fields. Of course, nocebo effect is always possible. That's the Pavlov reflex. We cannot question that. But if you have a nocebo effect, it's because you have a cause. There is no nocebo effect if there is no cause. So this does not exclude the causality for EHS and CMS. Thank you.